Hi everyone, this is the second video for Chapter 8, Week 12 information. And we're going to talk about Section 8.2 and just some of this vocabulary that you've been hearing around or you might have heard related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And just to clarify some of the words and show you how they're used in other ways. So here we're going to continue our discussion of microbiology, and we're going to talk about infectious disease. So there's lots of different kinds of disease. Somebody can get cancer, somebody can have diabetes, different things like that. But infectious disease is specifically disease caused by a microorganism. And so when we're looking at infectious disease, there's three words to describe kind of how it comes about. Uh, it, we have the term epidemic here. And so if you say that there's an epidemic of a disease, it just means you have over what's historically predicted or over like the historical average. So there's a relatively high amount of a certain disease. And so we have epidemics all the time. We have a seasonal flu epidemic. So if we look at the rate of influenza um, in Corning, New York, and we evaluate, we keep a graph of the numbers of cases. Always, we have certain months in the winter, I don't know if it starts in November, somewhere around there, that the numbers go up over what's typical, and then they drop down as the winter goes away. So an epidemic doesn't necessarily have to mean that everybody's it's something that we weren't familiar with or something new. It just means the number of cases is higher than normal. A lot of times we recognize that there's a problem when we see epidemics, like all of a sudden a bunch of people get measles or a lot of people get scarlet fever, something like that. And these are diseases that are around normally, but it allows people to evaluate like what's going on. Why are more people getting measles? Do our vaccines not work? Are people not getting vaccines? Is there a new strain of the virus around? So usually the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S. is the organization that keeps track of the data to figure out if we're having an epidemic. There's an area where people have a certain disease and it moves. The disease moves to another population, we can say that there's an outbreak. So it's similar to an epidemic, but it's talking about the movement of the disease from one population to another. So it says in an outbreak that disease moves between two populations. In an epidemic, the number of individuals who are infected exceeds what's normal in previous years. And then the last word that we have here is one we've heard a lot related to COVID-19 is the term pandemic. And so they're showing you here that a pandemic is when that disease spreads into many populations, and typically global, which gives us the pan, across the whole planet, across the whole world. And so a pandemic is going to be a very dramatic worldwide epidemic. And the thing to have a pandemic, it's typically a newer disease or a disease we haven't seen for a long time because a lot of people have to be susceptible to the disease. It says global epidemics are called pandemics, and here's some examples. HIV/AIDS. At one time, we didn't have, if we had cases of HIV, we weren't in that aware of it. There weren't that many people, but eventually it became something that spread through the world. SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, tuberculosis, malaria, influenza, all those are pandemics. I'm going to skip HIV, not because it's not cool, but just in the interest of time. I like to show you all these pictures of viruses. Here's the HIV virus, and here we have, the parts that we were talking about in the earlier video, where we have the protein coat, the capsid. In this case, there's some nucleic acid in there. HIV virus happens to have RNA. And then remember, some have envelopes and spikes. So there's a little diagram of the HIV virus. Okay. The other I just wanted to touch on, because I want to go to talk a little bit about drug resistance. and antibiotic resistance. And so tuberculosis is one of those organisms that's getting a lot of attention for becoming antibiotic resistant. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background on tuberculosis. It was first discovered in 1882, which is when a lot of bacteria were discovered, when we were learning that bacteria can actually cause diseases, late 1800s. And the scientist was Robert Koch, and he saw it under a microscope and was studying it in patients. In his day and before that, this disease was called consumption. So you might read a novel that talks about somebody dying of consumption, or there's a lot of historical figures that died of consumption, and that means what we call today tuberculosis. But tuberculosis is the bacteria grow in your lungs and reduce the amount of oxygen you can transfer into your blood, and therefore, hopefully, you remember a little bit about that you need oxygen to generate ATP, to generate energy, to metabolize our food. And so if you're not breathing well, you're not going to have a lot of energy and you appear to get consumed. And so tuberculosis is a bacterial infection of the lungs. And you can see here, in Koch's time, it killed around 14, or at that time, TB caused around 14% of the deaths in Europe. It was quite a common disease. One of the things that here we go. Even today, it says it's estimated that 1/3 of the world's population has been exposed to TB, and we have a significant number of people that die of tuberculosis every year in around the world. The bacteria that causes it, it says it's rod-shaped, so it's bacillus-shaped. It's called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. And you guys might be somewhat familiar with tuberculosis because a lot of people that are going into nursing have to be tested for tuberculosis. And one of the reasons is this bacterium is pretty tough. It's hard to, somebody who gets tuberculosis is going to cough a lot. And when they have active tuberculosis. And it turns out the bacteria, which is in this diagram here's some of these bacillus-shaped bacteria in this electron microscope picture. And these bacteria, when you cough them out, they actually have a special outer layer, a waxy layer, that prevents them from drying out. And so here it says that the bacteria can actually exist for weeks in a dehydrated state. So somebody in a hospital room who's coughing can spread tuberculosis bacteria all over that room, and weeks later, they could potentially be active still. And they could infect other people. So it's really important that we identify who has tuberculosis and that you use the proper cleaning and quarantining techniques to prevent the spread to other people. When somebody gets tuberculosis, it might take 4 to 12 weeks for the disease to develop. This bacteria actually grows pretty slowly, but it typically colonizes the lungs. And what it does is certain white blood cells engulf the tuberculosis bacteria, but the bacteria developed a strategy to grow inside of those white blood cells. So it kind of outsmarted the immune system a little bit. And they'll colonize the lungs in these clusters of white blood cells. And the patient isn't necessarily sick until something happens and it activates. And then these tubercles, these clusters of tuberculosis bacteria break open and start to spread through the lungs, and that's when the coughing happens and people can spread it to other people. And you can imagine if you're kind of having clusters growing in your lungs that are becoming liquefied and causing you to cough, that eventually they grow enough it could cause the patient to die from not being able to breathe well. Here it says bad cough, chest pain, coughing out blood or sputum, and progresses into fatigue, loss of appetite. They're going to lose weight and waste away. There's a little bit here on talking about using antibiotics to kill the tuberculosis bacteria. And we've actually had antibiotics that are very effective on tuberculosis, but it turns out that we've got, especially with the AIDS epidemic, we got a lot more people with tuberculosis and a much more bigger use of antibiotics. And we've developed antibiotic resistant tuberculosis, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next section. I also wanted to talk just a little bit about influenza, and everybody's familiar with influenza or the flu. And here it says every year it affects about 5 to 20% of Americans and about 36,000 fatalities in the U.S. Pretty much know the signs and symptoms of influenza, and we know that we acquire influenza by breathing in um, particles. And you can be pretty far away from somebody. You can be, across the room, and there could be influenza viruses kind of floating around. So you really want to stay away from people when they have influenza, or if you suspect you have it, wearing a mask is always a good idea. Influenza is not tough like the tuberculosis bacteria. Influenza is a virus. Tuberculosis is a bacterium, but influenza virus is not tough like the tuberculosis. It doesn't stay on surfaces for long times. It can be transferred by contaminated objects, but that over time, over short periods of time, those viruses will no longer be infectious. And so one of the things I wanted to mention when we talked about influenza is just we get influenza epidemics, we also get pandemics. And there's, again, the CDC keeps a track, and other organizations keep track of where's there a lot of influenza, what types of influenza are around. And one of the big problems is about 10 years ago, a little bit more than that, I think, there was an influenza virus called H5N1 that was first seen in birds, wild birds, and also domesticated chickens and ducks. And one of the things about this is it's a very lethal virus in birds, but it also has the ability to mutate or the potential to mutate and infect humans. So now if we have this new influenza virus, and again, this would be a new virus we've never seen, so we don't have any immunity to it. And what could happen is this very deadly virus could mutate from birds and infect people. And so that's something we've kept track of for many years to see what's going on with the H5N1 virus, what's going on with the bird flu that's circulating. We know it can infect a lot of birds and even kill a lot of birds, but so far it's only shown minimal ability to transfer to humans. And these would have been humans that are in very close contact with birds, although it's something that has the potential, again, to mutate, to change, and infect humans. So we definitely keep our eyes on the bird flu pandemic because it could lead to a human H5N1 pandemic, and it could be potentially deadly. So here's some vocabulary to check out, and I have written down that probably questions 1 and 4 would be the ones to work on. Why don't I stop there, and I'll do the last section in a third video.